Everyone, here is my diversity within deaf community compare and contrast project. First, we're going to start off with how is the deaf community diverse? In the deaf community, there are people from all ethnicities, races, religions, those of different sexualities, backgrounds. The overall picture is that everyone is different. Doesn't matter what culture or community you are from. While most of the members of the community in the deaf community share a common history or background with similar experiences, not one person is the same. Those who are deaf or involved in the deaf community have their own narrative and unique characteristics, which is the same as any other community. We're going to talk about deaf minority status at a global level. So in the Pakistan video, one of the individuals signed that deaf people are not treated as equals due to the communication barriers between the cultures. This is something that occurs on a global level and not just in Pakistan or in the United States. The Sign Language Cafe in Pakistan provides a safe place for those that are part of the deaf community and takes part in breaking that communication barrier that exists around the world. Those that come to that cafe must sign in sign language to be able to order. This just provides a way of connectiveness and acceptance of this culture. Next, we're going to be talking about the minorities within a minority. Being queer in and out of the deaf community poses challenges as they are oppressed by some of the straight people. Queer people are drawn to the deaf community and culture because they're able to find more acceptance in this minority compared to the straight community. Queer people, like any other culture, want to feel connected and accepted for who they are, which is why the general population needs to be more accepting and willing to learn about different minorities and cultures so that we were able to better understand them. We're going to be talking about oppression, specifically in the deaf culture. So the first way that oppression is present in the deaf culture is by assuming that being deaf or hard of hearing is a tragedy and something to be ashamed of. The deaf culture is so rich in history. It has their own language and way of communicating, same as those that are hearing. People should be encouraging people to be proud of who they are and what culture or community they belong to. Being deaf or hard of hearing is not a tragedy, but it's a way of identity and it's who they are. Second, employment is another way that the deaf culture is oppressed. There are instances when those that are deaf or hard of hearing are turned down for job opportunities or they're not paid equally. Equality is so important, and the deaf community should not be discriminated against because of their background or culture. Those that are deaf or hard of hearing bring as much to the table as those that are not. We need to stop the stigma that those that are deaf or hard of hearing in this community cannot bring as much to the table because of their disability. This is not the case. The third way that deaf people are oppressed is that there's a stigma that those in the deaf community cannot do certain things because they are deaf or hard of hearing. This is incorrect. This community is filled with people who are just as capable as anyone else. So we're going to move on to how deaf culture differs from the American culture. So first we're going to talk about body language and facial expressions. In ASL, or in the deaf culture, body language and facial expressions are so important because that's the way that people are able to understand how they're communicating, and versus the American culture, we don't use facial expressions or body language as much because we use more auditory. And the American Sign Language, they're more visual because they don't have that auditory capabilities that those that are hearing have. The next is direct versus indirect with language. So in the deaf culture, it is more known to be more direct with their language, or they don't beat around the bush. They say what they want to say versus Americans have more of, the American culture is more, they kind of hide. They don't really say what's on their minds. They're pretty indirect. The next thing about how deaf culture differs from American culture is eye contact. So the deaf culture maintains so much eye contact compared to that of the American culture. The American culture, a lot of people don't like eye contact. They like to look away when you're communicating with someone, or only hold eye contact for certain periods of time. Versus in the deaf culture, it's important to hold eye contact so that you're able to fully understand what it is that they're communicating to you. The next way that the deaf culture differs from American culture is that the deaf culture has more of a connectedness. This community is so tight-knit, and they're so accepting and welcoming to those that are outside of the community and those that are inside of their community. And not only that, but how a room is set up is so important to the deaf culture. They like to be set up more in open spaces, more when you're in a room, they like to be in a circle so that everyone can see everyone, and it's easier for them to connect and easier for them to communicate with one another. Next, we're going to be talking about important deaf people from history. So the first one is James Denison. He was a deaf delegate in the International Congress of Education on the Deaf. He voted against only spoken language for deaf students. He was a super important person in deaf education. The next one is Helen Keller, who is one of the most famous deaf people in history. She was an educator and activist for both women's rights as well as deaf rights. And then the third person is Clayton Valli. He is a deaf linguist and ASL poet. He was the first person to identify ASL poetry as a literary genre. Sources that I used.